This is the great Johannes speaking for another weekly podcast episode. I hope my webcam and mic setup are audible and visible. And then today I wanted to discuss a whole article by a woman named Louise Perry, the author of The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. She wrote a lengthy article in a magazine or an online magazine called First Things, which is very conservative, it seems. And I just wanted to discuss the whole thing and also give my own thoughts with it, because she arrives at the similar conclusions that I've arrived at in my TikTok videos over the past few years. So it's nice to see that there are others who think it's going to go the same way. Um, Let me start with the introduction here. So I'm quoting her. Our various political crises in 2024 represent the early stages of the transition we are all about to go through. As older voters outnumber the young, aging democracies. No, sorry. As older voters outnumber the young, aging democracies become increasingly gerontocratic, ruled by old people. And spending on the old is protected even as the tax burden on the young becomes even more punitive. Desperate for young people to keep the economic show on the road, governments permit massive flows of migrants from poor parts of the world that are still fertile, on the assumption that human beings are little more than fungible economic units. These regions' populations are dissatisfied, but mostly passive, at least thus far. This is the stage at which we find ourselves. Somebody asks if I am Pipiska. I don't know what that is. So I might interact with the audience, and of course I'll read your comments later. After I've discussed the article, I will definitely have a look at the comments and see if I can answer more questions. But yeah, so the whole premise of this article is we have aging but wealthy old people in the Western world. They're bringing in young people for their servicing, like the NHS in the UK, for example, the health system, where we need cheap nurses and cheap caretakers and so on. And we get our young people, the ones who still make money, to pay for all that, because the migrants aren't free. The migrants are the labor you need, but they don't really earn themselves back, if you know what I mean. They're a net cost to the society, paid for by others who are still more successful making money and paying all the taxes into the welfare system that is serving an older generation clinging to life. And we'll get to that in a bit. Right. Rory says, we're taxing the sensible to give to the fools. Yeah. So we're creating a problem here. That's true. So let me start from the top of the article. The article's title, by the way, is Modernity's Self-Destruct Button. So you can see where this is going, right? The Amish are going to win. By Louise Perry, issue of December 2024. So it's next month's issue. Along with almost every other high-income Western country, Britain is experiencing mass immigration against the wishes of the majority of its voters. Having taken the outcome of the 2016 Brexit referendum literally rather than seriously, the government has stopped the flow of migrants from Eastern Europe and replaced it with a much larger flow of migrants from sub-Saharan Africa and the Indian subcontinent. A country that was 99.9% white in 1951 is projected to become a minority autochthonous at some point before the end of this century. We're talking about the United Kingdom, but it applies to the USA, Germany, France. I mean, look at Paris, look at Berlin. These are not places. The Berlin mayor warned Jews and some other group of people not to venture into certain Arab neighborhoods anymore. Right. But white people aren't safe in Germany at all. So, it's a bit of a strange reality here. And so what she's talking about is something that I've personally witnessed. I was traveling a lot years ago, and I also spent a month in London. I was in a hostel, and I found there lots of people from France. This was before Brexit. Lots of people from France, from Germany, from Poland, young people looking for jobs in London. They couldn't get housing, but the migrants coming in that same year, good. They got housing. So I met people I met British people, native British people, who'd been living in a hostel for over 2 years because they couldn't afford housing, but they had jobs. They were working full time, whereas migrants coming from nowhere who are supposed to solve the NHS's labor problem, they get free housing, they get proper housing, even if they don't make money. So here you see what is happening. The young native people are squeezed to pay for the low-cost labor migrants who are supposed to service an older generation. That's the whole point of the article, that this is not a healthy system and it's not sustainable. Hold on. Right, so this process has been represented by the British government as a natural phenomenon, as inevitable as weather. We're talking about mass immigration to bring in the laborers who have to wipe old people's asses in the hospital. And then she mentions that, Trudeau in Canada recently also wants to close the borders in Canada. But here you see why, right? Money. The ruling classes or the financial elites of Canada are starting to feel the downside of bringing in millions of people, mostly from India and Pakistan, who are not actually contributing to the economy, right? They're not really bringing money in. They're a cost to society, paid for by state coffers and tax reserves, and very quickly you deplete those. All of a sudden, the ruling classes realize they have to end up footing the bill. Or as they do in the UK now, let's just sell the farmers' land to foreign investors to cough up the cash needed to pay for all sorts of deficits in their own management, right? And then, we have all these politicians in Europe. Meloni of Italy, I think she's a Fed or a fraud or whatever. She's called far right, but she doesn't actually do anything about what far right people want. She doesn't actually close the borders, right? And now even Japan, which has historically been alone among high-income countries in keeping immigration levels extremely low, is loosening its border restrictions, right? So you may have seen this, right? Have you seen the memes on if you follow some Asian people, like Japanese people on Twitter, X, you'll see them talking about how they are now discovering the benefits of diversity, posting all sorts of wild memes. This has led me to say, or to think that, give the Japanese, give the Chinese 5 years of diversity training as we've had in the West for the past 50, and we've got some allies. We'll end up being allies in the same conflict, right? So I'm reading from this article by Louise Perry, if you're just joining. She's the author of The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. And so I'm quoting her. Britain may have pursued mass migration more intensively than most other countries, but the larger pattern is evident worldwide. The flow of people from the poor world to the rich world in the 21st century is as strong and as historically significant as the flow of people from the old world to the new once was. Yeah. So we're being replaced. There's no hiding it, right? So the governments permitting this flow, the mass migration, have made an economic pact with their voters. You may not like mass immigration, but the payoff is lower taxes and higher quality public services. This is the assumption, assuming that the mass influx of people is actually going to bring money in, is actually going to solve problems, make things more efficient, and it's not, right? In Germany, I know, for example, there's a group of migrants living in Germany, half of them can't read. Then you're unemployable. And who's paying for that? Who's paying for the welfare? Other people who still have jobs are paying for that. It's just not feasible. It's not sensible, right? So, at the time of writing, by Louise Perry, Britain is in recession. After 15 years of stagnant growth, a stagnation which has coincided with a historically unprecedented surge in immigration. Yeah. So under Keir Starmer's regime, you see the policies of his predecessors finally come together, right? You have mass immigration, but the economy is still dwindling and decline. In fact, the more migration came in, as migration began to accelerate, the economic collapse also began to accelerate. It's almost as if one thing leads to another. Or at the very least, no matter how many people you bring in, that immigration cannot save your economy, because your economy relies on productivity and creativity by very smart people, conscientious people, right, who are willing to give to society. And if you're only bringing in the takers, you wipe out. Put bluntly, the people on whom modernity depends are failing to reproduce themselves, meaning the modern, high IQ, Northwest European type of person, which means that modernity itself is failing to reproduce itself. She's actually signaling here, if you read between the lines, that there is a certain ethnic type of person, the Northwest Europeans. She calls them British people, but I suppose it includes the Northwest Europeans by extension, right? The Germans also started an industrial revolution just around the time when the British started theirs. And it is those smart people who were invested in their society, who cared about advancing their people, who put in their time, blood, sweat, and tears. They raised their people, from the swamps into the technological age, into the urban, modern civilization, right? If those people are no longer reproducing and are no longer working on such high-level, high IQ jobs, it ends. It just stops. You can't just bring in lowbrow people. They're great for delivering your food and your packages, but they're not going to be the innovators that you needed to usher this civilization into the space age. No, you're actually going to be held back. And the author Louise Perry makes that claim as well later on, where it's nice to have people who can oil the machinery, but if you have no one left, no more architects, no more visionaries to design new machines, it ends. Your civilization just grinds to a halt. And we're in that phase now, where we still dream of the future like Elon Musk does, or Peter Thiel, right, co-founder of PayPal. We have still visionary dreamers, but no more visionary technologists actually making those dreams real. As a civilization, we are running on the fumes of the accomplishments of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. They gave us electricity, sanitary engineering, antibiotics, antisepsis, vaccination, and so on and so forth. The airplane, the computer, rail transport, right? But ever since, we haven't really invented that much more new stuff. We've made our computers smaller into cell phones. We've electrified our bicycles. We've electrified our cars. But it's the same thing, basically. We haven't really invented anything new. I think Peter Thiel, who is a member of the Intel community in the USA, I think he's with the CIA. Peter Thiel says, we have 100 times as many PhD students graduating, in the past few years than we did, say, 50 years ago. But they produce 100 times fewer great new insights and inventions. So basically, PhD students, right, have become effectively worthless. They're not really contributing to the society anymore as a group, right, as a whole. Maybe the individual genius is still there, but as a group, what purpose do they serve? We are an overeducated Western world. We've become a bureaucratic Moloch that is unable to sustain itself, unable to reproduce itself. And she goes on to talk about lots of things. The growth in British population in the 18th and 19th centuries was not incidental to British world dominance, but rather an essential precondition for it. Britain was able to achieve this democratic feat because it was the first country in the world to industrialize, which meant that it was also the first country in the world to experience a simultaneous increase in both population and per capita income, right? So you have a population of smart people, they multiply rapidly, and because of that, because they're so invested in their future, they manage to create the material wealth to feed all those people. Industrialization was in many ways a trauma for the British working classes because they were removed from the countryside and huddled into filthy factories. But contrary to the popular association between industrialization and ill health, the Industrial Revolution, in fact, enabled a drop in mortality. More children survived. Other European countries, such as Germany, then later followed Britain. And there's a whole story about how German industry was actually outcompeting Britain at some point and became this little threat that needed to be destroyed in World War I and World War II. But that's a whole nother story. Right. So why did they have to go to the cities? The rural people, well, they had too many children and they couldn't really work on the farm anymore because the farms became mechanized. So they became more efficient. And now you have a lot of sons and daughters who don't need to work on a farm anymore. So you send them to the city to work in the factories to make clothes and pottery and whatever other things like, machine-made stuff. So that's why, really, because of the technological advances in the countryside, now you can have one guy, one farmer farming a massive piece of land instead of 20 laborers working together, right? And what are you supposed to do with the 19 who are no longer needed? Well, you send them to the city so they become lawyers and accountants. So Europe and her colonies attained military and cultural power only because they had a large supply of warm young bodies, lots of people to send to war, and many eager young minds capable of innovation. And here she says something very interesting, like explorers, scientists, and business founders have traditionally always been overwhelmingly young men who want to start something, who want to explore their creative prowess, right? And so when you don't have enough of those kinds of men anymore, all right, if you don't have the men with the sort of drive to spend 20, 30, 40 years of their life to build something up, to invent something genius like Elon Musk has done, for example, well, then kind of your society, your progress halts, especially if you're mass migrating in a different kind of person that is very greedy and wants to have a lot of gives, right? But doesn't have the intellectual capacity to advance the society they're joining, right? Hold on just a minute. So whatever the cause, we can now confidently separate world history into two distinct periods, before and after industrialization. Now, if you look at any number of long-term trends, wealth, population size, carbon emissions, I don't really believe in that personally, but life expectancy, they all show the same inflection point around the year 1800. So with the industrial age came massive population growth in the West because the new technologies were able to feed, clothe, and house all those people. But at the same time, these were the smart people that you needed in order to invent the machinery. Right, so it was a positive feedback loop. And that feedback loop has come to an end in our time. It's turned negative. We feed and house more people, but there's fewer people willing and able to maintain that system, let alone try to advance it with new inventions, right? Right, so, yeah, I'm Dutch. So we've become too comfortable. I was going to comment on this. We have experienced the past 50 years or so the age of comfort. We've had everything for everyone for a long time, at least in the Western world. But the comfort has also bred a false sense of security. The belief that we don't need to protect ourselves anymore, that we don't need to defend our land anymore, that we can just share everything with everyone and welcome everyone in, the inclusion cult and the LGBT cult, and we're all equal. And then, of course, all of a sudden, the native women start getting raped, boys start getting murdered, right? And all of a sudden, we realize or begin to realize that we have, in fact, invited the enemy. The enemy is still there. We just didn't recognize him because we thought they were like children, childlike creatures who were just fun to be with, right? And then it turns out they're vicious killers and murderers and rapists. And that transition, I think now with the Trump re-election, people are starting to become a little bit more aware of this problem, right? That you can want equality and inclusion as much as you like, but that doesn't mean you're going to have it in the real world. Right? This is not a Disney movie. So almost every piece of modern speculative fiction assumes that life on Earth will change as much in the coming 200 years as it did in the past 200 years. Basically, everybody's expecting the Bitcoin price to moon to $1 million per coin, or 10 million, right? We're all expecting our advanced civilization to become the space age, as we've seen in the books called The Foundation by Isaac Asimov or something, or Star Trek or Star Wars. And what if all of that is just pure fiction, speculative fiction? Many academics assume progress will continue to progress and to accelerate, right? That's the whole belief of progressive liberalism, by the way. The liberal left believe that progress is accelerating and it will keep accelerating if only those evil fascist Republicans would be taken out, right? So the future is expected to contain manifold wonders and horrors, right? From super intelligent AI to interplanetary colonization. But the author here doesn't believe we will ever get there. This reminds me of another website called ourfiniteworld.org by a woman named Gail de Verberg. And she also does a lot of math and calculations to figure out, we are running out of resources in such and such a way. There are a lot of very smart people who understand the law of diminishing returns. For example, you've read in the news that Bitcoin's price was surging, and they call it what do they call it? They call it a rally, but it's just 35%. Bitcoin used to have 20,000% rallies, but they don't happen anymore, right? Those kinds of rallies are over. So Bitcoin's rallies go from like 20,000% rallies to 200%, 100%, and now 35% is a rally, right? So that's a diminishing return. It's still there, but the way it works is the more people you throw at a system, the less rewards that system can give back to all of those people. And we're just going through that phase, but it has an ending. The ending is that the system fails eventually. And so we are suffering in the Western world a low fertility crisis. Even though we are extremely wealthy, we are unable to convert that wealth into having more children of our own. Specifically, the high IQ creative children who become, especially the males, driven to progress their society. We don't have that many anymore, right? And so people feel that we may return to a theocracy, right? That's something I've been speaking about. I've always been speaking about return to religion. And I think our whole society is going that way. We're going to return to a more traditional way of life that is based on religion, right? You won't have electricity probably, but you will have a horse and carriage if you feed the horse well, right? And so here's a funny little section. A detail that anyone who has read the novel by Margaret Atwood will surely remember is the bizarre obsession that many of the people of the 2020s develop with their pets. Oh no, this is from another book by P.D. James, The Children of Men, right? So people develop an obsession with their pets, just as cats and dogs are given prams, clothes, and Instagram accounts, right? And so people begin to treat their pets as baby replacements. Right? It's a very real thing, right? We see it everywhere. And then she goes, so the author I'm reading from, Louise Perry, she mentions that, well, in the Western world, our replacement fertility rate is dropping. This is happening everywhere, in South America as well, North Africa, Asia, right? And India recently reached its point where they dropped to 2.1. They're now dropping below their replacement rate. That means even India is going to see the same thing we've seen in the Western world. And ultimately also Nigeria. Nigeria and places like that, and Ethiopia maybe last, but they will experience eventually the same outcomes, meaning they too are going to have low birth rates eventually. In fact, in many areas in Nigeria, people have low birth rates already. It's just certain parts more inland, the rural parts of Nigeria, where they still have 6 or 7 children per woman. But in many other parts, they don't. So, economically, you can do the math, and there's a certain inflection point. At a certain level of wealth, people start preferring the wealth over having children, and they run with that basically toward extinction. So she explains that it's actually the most educated people, the sort of people who value material wealth the most. Those are the atheistic urban people who like to have their lattes at Starbucks. Those kinds of people are the ones who will end up having the smallest families or no children at all, right? So, I think we arrive here at, she mentions it as well, a link with what Martin Heidegger has been warning of. Technology has become merely a tool for human beings to rape nature, plunder and pillage nature, and to use the whole planet as a giant fuel station. I've quoted this many times before, also in my book Revival of the West. Do we really perceive the world, Gaia or the Earth, as just resources for us to use and squander? Clearly, that proposition was a very one-sided idea from the people who started the industrial age, and we're reaching all sorts of limits, if not mostly moral limits. Like, people just don't want to go on with this anymore. More and more people say they want to return to tradition, live off the grid, get away from the big cities, get away from the material lifestyle where life is about having the latest sneakers. Why not make a pair of shoes that lasts you 40 years, right? So, yeah, we live in a culture of squander, in the Western world at least. And whether or not places like India, Ethiopia, or Nigeria are going to copy that model, eventually the Earth is going to run out of resources. So, if I were a Nigerian in Nigeria, I would be quick to get access to the wealth, because you're probably only going to experience it for 5 years or so, and it's going to be over and gone forever. Because the massive machinery needed to produce that kind of high quality wealth will not be maintained. There won't be people smart enough or interested enough in, pushing that kind of machinery forward any longer. So techno-pessimists like me predict that our natural resources will become utterly depleted, potentially causing the destruction of life on Earth. And the techno-optimists predict that we will simply find new solutions and, find a way out of this crisis using green energy and space colonies. Basically, Elon Musk is an optimist, right? I'm the pessimist in this sense. But there's another possibility, is that simply whether or not you have the wealth or the money, people just don't want to go along with it anymore, right? Yeah, progress is just an illusion, right? So, and now we get to a bit more of a, important part. So, at the heyday of European colonialism, white people used to be like 30 to 40% of the global population, or at some point maybe even 50%. And the African population was just 8%, but this has now reversed. Africa is almost nearing, by the end of the century, 30 to 40% of the global population. And the Western people, including North America, will only be like 13%. And that includes all the immigrants who've come to live with us. I think today, the actual percentage of people classified as white people, traditionally, we make up barely 8% of the global population. And less than 2% of people in the world are white women who can still have children. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to go extinct. What it does mean is that other groups who have more children are obviously the ones who are going to survive. And so she mentions the Amish people, who are white people living in the USA, but they have the highest birth rates in the entire Western world, and higher than Muslims, higher than the migrants coming in. And they have... they double their population every so many years. And so she predicts that if this continues, then eventually the Amish will be the dominant group in the USA. But when they are dominant, they will be living in a United States without electricity, obviously, right? So assuming that the industrial age is going to be end up looking like a failure, it's going to collapse, right? People like the Amish or the Mennonites, and I've spoken about this many times in my TikTok videos. That's why I like this article so much, because she touches on so many points that I've always been talking about in my TikTok videos. That people like the Amish and the Mennonites are going to end up being the winners, who basically outlive modernity when everybody else, the Starbucks cat people, they're the ones who are not going to make it, right? Modern civilization started in the Western world, in fact, in Great Britain, because that's where we started the Industrial Revolution. That's what we call modern civilization. And then Germany followed very quickly. So it was the Europeans who started the modern world, and you are all living in it. So, but don't worry, it might not last very long. More than half of the young sub-Saharan Africans already say they want to emigrate to the rich world, to Europe, North America, and so on. And that desire will only become stronger if climate change produces extreme weather. I don't really believe in the climate change thing, though, but we already have seen a stirring of right-wing nationalism across Europe, where proximity to Africa, because we are divided only by the Mediterranean Sea, makes these migrant flows more alarming. And political opposition to mass migration from the third world is likely to grow, right? To some extent, but even today we have a massive far left media body that tries to prevent the opposition, the right-wing opposition, from materializing into groups so that we can start pushing back, right? Now, you can hear stories of our remigration, like sending migrants back. I think Canada is starting to do this. To some extent, small countries like Denmark and Sweden have said they have done this or started doing this, but it all depends on the scale, because sending back half a percentage doesn't matter. You need to send back like 80%, right? And so young people living in our time, in the modern age, in the Western world, are being drained of their vitality. Eventually, welfare system in the rich world will have to shrink and die out, because there's no one there to pay for all this. When the old age pension was introduced in Britain in 1908, it was made available only to people over the age of 70, and only 24% of the population ever reached that age. So nowadays it's very different. Like, lots of people reach, in the Netherlands, for example, they reach age 58 and they get a pension, and they live off of that for another 30 or 40 years. That's a very different story. That is a story of young people, an increasingly smaller group of young people, being forced to support a very large group of old people, right, who are no longer productive. And that is a recipe for a declining, dying society, basically. It's a Ponzi scheme, and that's correct. Western demographics, or the global demographic, is a Ponzi scheme of the old age pension, right? And it's collapsing, right? Pensions are a Ponzi scheme. People deny this, but it is a Ponzi scheme, right? Because the people, even if migrants would come in and pay taxes for those pensions, those migrants themselves will never have pensions. So it is a Ponzi scheme. I myself don't expect ever to have a pension payout. That is because, say, 20, 25 years from now, or 30 years from now, when I might be eligible, because they're going to stretch the age up from 70 to 71 to 72 to 74, right? But at some point you'll be eligible, and you're going to say we don't have the money anymore. And I expect that to happen to my generation already. That what am I, elder millennial? We're not going to get pensions. The money will be run out by the time we are supposed to be eligible, right? So how's that going to look like then for the younger generations? Well, it means that the old people, the elderlies, will have to be taken care of by their own children. And that means by the daughters, usually, by the women. But of course, in the Western world, right, if you don't have children, there won't be anybody to take care of you when you're old, right? In the end, we will have to revert to the system that prevailed for all human history up until a century ago. The elderly will be taken care of privately, right? Healthcare for the old will be mostly palliative. And the only safety net for the poor and lonely will be provided by charities. Everybody else will simply die out. You'll just starve, right? They used to call orphanages death houses, right? They used to call elderly homes death houses. The orphans and the elderly were just sent to places where they were not expected to live very long, right? So here she says something quite extreme. She says the only policy solution available within the dominant framework is legalized euthanasia. So all these Western nations, look at Canada. Canada has been pushing this very aggressively. They call it MAID. This is like medically assisted informed dying or something. I don't know the exact acronym meaning, but Canada has been doing this for the past 2 years in an extreme aggressive push to get old people to die, to get sick people to kill them off, to offer even euthanasia to bums walking around the street. If you're a homeless person, they will ask you, do you need help? Yeah, I need help. Would you like to have euthanasia? That's the second question. That's how extreme it is, right? And so governments in the Western world realize that one of their largest population expenses is maintaining pension plans for the elderly and maintaining their medical costs. And what if you could get rid of them? What if there's like, I don't know, a virus that requires you to have jabs, but the jabs aren't really a medicine. The jabs are really what's killing you. All right. Who knows? We'll find out in the next few years what those GB's jabs have really done to people. Right. I hope you understand this. Governments are run by psychopaths and they will kill off the elderly. They will do it, right? Whether they tell you up front or whether they lie about it or come up with some excuse or like nuclear war or something, and then there's radiation that is, right? See where I'm going? They can tell you whatever because you'll believe the news anyway. And so I'm almost finishing the discussion of this article, And so here she mentions again that the Amish have a birth rate at least as high as that of the 19th century Britons, which was extremely high, like 7 or 9 children per woman, right? But they also enjoy low child mortality rates because they're surrounded by a high-tech culture, hospitals, right? That suppresses infectious disease as well. So she also predicts that it is hyper-fertile groups like the Amish, religious fundamentalist groups, traditionalist people with a low energy footprint, but with a lot of kids, who will define the future of humanity. The world they create will look quite different from our own, right? It will not be the future of Elon Musk. We will not go to Mars, right? It will look like a static, patriarchal, parochial, low-tech, clannish, religious, and dependent on sunlight and muscle. The great experiment of Britain's Industrial Revolution may not be remembered at all. It may be considered a failure, something displeasing to God, right? And then she ends it. This is the final paragraph I'm reading, then I'll discuss a little more with you in the comment section. So some readers may wonder whether this might not be a good thing. In the end, given that modernity seems hell-bent on destroying itself. As the conservative writer Dave Green puts it, for the more reactionary among us, the decline of modern cultural systems in the wake of modern problems may seem like a solution in itself. Isn't it easier to let live and die? And that's exactly what I've always been saying. In many of my TikTok videos, I've always said, return to tradition kind of implies the death of this society, revolt against the modern world, right? Just let it die. Wouldn't that be a good thing? We would solve so many problems. We wouldn't have the diversity and the mass immigration. You wouldn't have to live with Islam. You'd have your own ethno-religious clans. Basically, like the Aryan horse riders, the Yamnaya or something, right? You can have your own little bubble that you fiercely defend, right? Against others you just don't want to live with anymore. What's wrong with that? See, there's nothing really wrong with that, especially if that's how people have always lived, and we're going to return to precisely that, right? Return to tradition, revolt against the modern world. We're going to put an end to all this nonsense, the modern nonsense. I don't believe it. I've spoken to other people, in this scene, right? And they all say the same thing. We don't believe that we're going to go to Mars and have like a real robot future. These are like gimmicks that they can please us with for a while, but eventually we're going to have to live like the Amish, right? So, what are we going to do? We're going to colonize the subarctic, right? We're going to escape the cities before they collapse, right? A minority of us will do that, right? Uh, and we're going to figure out how to survive from scratch without electricity, right? With low fuel, right? Maybe just wood to burn to stay warm in the winter, and then go from there. And we may actually end up being the survivors, right? I wouldn't place my bets on modern civilization. I would place my bets on the people who go off the grid and the Amish and so on. I think they are going to make it. Now, we don't want to return to the Middle Ages. We want to return to the Bronze Age, like 5,000 years ago. Bomb them back to the Bronze Age, right? Right, we built nations before. It may happen again. And there's maybe that's how it always will be. We start from primitiveness, right? In the jungle or in the tundra or in the cold forests of Europe, and from there we build our civilizations out. And maybe it's repetitive; it repeats itself that way. Right? Having a look at your comments because so I was discussing the whole program. I was discussing this article by Louise Perry, the author of The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. I thought it was very interesting. It's like normally I don't always read the articles like that, but I thought this time was a good idea to try it because I thought she had very good points that I touch upon often. Right? I will keep talking about more often. Well, you say European nations aren't lost yet, but if I look at the Netherlands, it's just overcrowded. You can't drive a car during the week from A to B without being stuck in traffic somewhere. It's just overcrowded, overwhelmingly overcrowded. And the whole atmosphere is not pleasant. People, because in order to maintain this complex society, you need so much suppression of your thoughts. You are actually killing creativity. The most creative people simply cannot be creative in these circumstances any longer. Right? Right, we're going back to the pre-industrial revolution. Yeah, that's exactly the point. Yeah. I have read Samuel Huntington, yeah, The Clash of Civilizations, yeah. Though I think in this configuration, Europe might as well work together with Russia rather than be enemies, because Russia has white people in it, Christians, same kind of culture or similar relatable culture, right? Islam does not offer us anything relatable, and Islam doesn't really offer us anything creative that we care about. So it's a strange thing that we now live in a world where Europe has to ally with Islam against Russia. Why don't we ally with the Christians against Islam? I don't get it. But regardless of which way that kind of war goes, there's only going to be losers anyway, and the winners are going to be the Amish, right? Yeah, it makes no sense. Yeah, I don't think Russian people are pro-Islam for the same reason that the EU is bringing this in. They're doing the same in Russia, right? So why don't we quit that and work together against the common enemy? I mean, it's not that hard to understand, right? All right, I thought this was a useful effort to discuss this article because I think it's a true and fairly correct projection of the future we are headed toward. We are going back to tradition. The modern world will not make it. We're not going to go to Mars, right? And why don't we just embrace that? I think the reactionary right, to which I count myself, should definitely just embrace that and say, okay, this is just what we're going to do. This is what's going to happen. We're going to prepare for the end of things like the internet and electricity and TV. Those things are going to go away during our lifetimes, right? I may be old when it happens, but it will happen. I may witness it. And then we need to have a plan. What are we going to do next? We need to have fertile land, right? We need to have some fuel that is accessible. It could be wood from the subarctic, right? So land and wood and horses, something for transportation. And then we can live. We can live as small, isolated, ethno-religious, ethno-nationalist little outposts here and there. What's wrong with that? Like, I don't get it. Right. And perhaps third world war with Russia will end our civilization anyway. It will certainly bankrupt us. If you know that Great Britain was bankrupted at the end of World War II. They spent everything they had to defeat the Germans, right? But Britain was bankrupt, right? All right. So if there's not that much interesting commentary, then I'm going to call it quits over here. I will upload the video to YouTube at The Great Johannes. And you may also find it on my newsletter later, www.jmk.info. You can subscribe there for free, or if you want, you can send a donation. I also happen to have a Buy Me a Coffee page where you can buy me a coffee. It's at Johannes MK. I think you'll find it that way on Buy Me a Coffee. I definitely love the support I'm getting from people. I've been doing this. I just realized I've been doing this for like 3 years or so already. 4 years maybe on TikTok, maybe 3 years. And I've gone through this massive journey myself where I was able to fully develop all my thoughts about what's going on in the world, and also to start seeing more clearly that vision of basically the reactionary right are right. We're going back to tradition, the end of modernity. That's just where it's really headed. And more people are also starting to realize this. And so we can start a movement. We can start a sort of escapist movement where we preempt ourselves from the collapse of modernity, escape just in time to start over somewhere else more safely, and then let the rest just rot, just let it burn. All right, then I'm going to close off with that, and I'll probably speak to viewers next week, Wednesday as well. So catch you later, though.